Hey Abiding Harvesters, congratulations on 20 years. What an amazing journey it's been. And if you've been with us all along the way, you've had a front row seat to see God come through for those who are following Him and trying to do that as faithfully as possible, but just ordinary folks discovering an extraordinary God as their partner in an incredible journey. But all along the way, it has been resisted and opposed, and God has come through again and again. Perhaps the biggest sign of that breakthrough was something that many said would never happen, and that was in 2007. We moved into this permanent facility, or at least a facility that we owned, rather than moving from location to location as we outgrew each place incrementally. We were in 7 different locations before we got here. The first place was the Corvette Cathedral over at 81st and Yale, and then after that we moved to Tulsa Tech Center for a few times, and then prayed over a place and discovered an office park that met our expectations down to the exact rooms and the square footage that at the time we didn't know existed. We moved into the Ford Glass Plant office park there, close to the Ford Glass Plant, and then from there we started renting schools because that space became too small. We rented Cedar Ridge on the weekends and had our opening celebration in the 7th grade center. And then after that we moved to a more permanent, larger location where we wouldn't have to do church out of a box, as I called it, unloading a trailer in the morning and loading it back up with all of our sound equipment and nursery equipment every single Sunday, folding chairs and me playing the guitar. Gosh, that was horrible. We moved to an office park over behind Sooner Barbecue, if you remember where that was, over 61st and Mingo. At that location, we were zealous for reaching our community as we are now. And we bought out 2 movie houses for the playing of The Passion of the Christ, which at the time was a very controversial opportunity that few churches seized, but our church had the courage to do that. During those years, we came to the point that we needed to raise the funds for this first phase. And on the very Sunday that we were going to give the great push for the first pledge program of our church, we discovered that Katrina, the tragedy of the Katrina event, had happened just the weekend before. My heart was burdened. I came to the church and I couldn't tell our people to pledge all that they had into a building when people were hurting. And in the middle of my sermon, I just kind of broke down and admitted that and told them we're going to try to build this building, but if any of you want to help with that situation, just meet me in my office. I was expecting 3 or 4 people. 40 people showed up, lined into the hall. And we invited a family of 6 from the Katrina tragedy to relocate to Tulsa. And we furnished their apartment and paid for the place that they were going to live, and they went on after schooling here to become missionaries in Africa. Their daughter's a star soccer player at ORU right now. Impossible situations when you get in them with God. It's amazing what happens. It always seems the fruit is out on the end of the limb, and if you're courageous enough to get there, you've got a front row seat to what God's going to do next. We had a church at one time approach us, and they wanted to close their church, sell their property, and bring that money and join our church, and we'd build a church together. And when we didn't feel led to do that, the pastor of that church said, "There's no way you're ever going to survive without us. There's no way you'll ever build a building. Your finances don't promise that possibility in the next 10 years. But we followed God. And it was amazing how God provided for that. He was right. There was no way we had the finances to build this building. We raised all that we could, wanted a loan for the maximum that we could possibly afford. Our builders, our design builders, told us we were still hundreds of thousands short. But then our architects at the time, a new architectural firm, risked blowing the whistle that the builders that we were working with at the time were not being faithful. They were not value engineering the project. They saw us as a desperate situation that they could take advantage of. And they risked telling us that. We got a new builder. The new builder got it in to the budget, and it looked like we could do it. We had a loan secured with the United Methodist Foundation, and then that loan fell through for reasons too complicated to explain. And so in a stray phone call with the Oklahoma Foundation president, he saw our impasse, and he said, "You know, I had a conversation just last week with the Texas Foundation, and they told us that if we ever needed to make a loan for more than is our policy, that they'd be willing to explore being partners with us. And since this is beyond our range, we can't help you. Let me call them and just see if they'll come through. And within 2 weeks, something that had never been done, a United Methodist Foundation and one conference partnering with another, we had a loan to build the building. At the same time, it fell apart again when the land, the option on the next acreage adjacent to us, said that they couldn't continue to give us an option on that land, that the land was too hot and they would need to sell it and sell it soon. If we couldn't buy it, they'd have to sell it to somebody else. We couldn't pay for the land and pay for the building too. It was going to destroy the whole process. A few members of our church came up with an idea. We'd start a LLC and invite people to invest in it. They would take their retirement savings and put it in this, and we would be able to secure the next acres and they would hold it for us. That was a new idea. No one had ever thought of it before, but God got us through that impossible situation again. Time after time after time, when we hit a wall, God would show us He's not finished with us yet. And there, we continued to grow in place until we were able to move into this facility January 29th, 2007. But in the process of all that growth and necessary relocation, a lot was going on, and God came through with a breakthrough in each particular moment. It started as soon as Cheryl and I moved up here from Houston. We met with the committee that called us here, the Tulsa District Land and Location Committee. If you speak Methodese, you know what that is. It's a district committee that calls a pastor to start a new church. We shared with them our vision for a church. They didn't know what a cell church was, and frankly, they were skeptical. Only one pastor in the group spoke up at a critical moment when things were not going our way and said, you know, if we've asked this couple to come up here and start this church, I guess we owe it to them to get behind them. I've never heard of a cell church, but if that's what God's called them to do, let's not oppose God. Let's get behind them. And with that, the committee shifted. And we had permission to do church as we thought we wanted to, and as God had called us to. And since that time, we've been true to that vision from the very beginning. This is still a church with home teams that values community as much as a crowd. And that was very unusual at the time, but that's what God was calling us to pursue, and because we did, He met us at every point along the way. Even the name was opposed. Abiding Harvest, that doesn't sound like a Methodist church. It ought to be Saint something, or first or second or third something, or but Abiding Harvest, what is that? Well, it's the Great Commission and the Great Commandment in 2 words. Couldn't be even any more central to the gospel of Jesus Christ or the calling of a church. Doing church in small groups. Almost immediately after the church started organizing and meeting together in small groups and was congregating together on the weekends for the first time, we got a dawning piece of news that a mega church in our area was considering moving into the same small, narrow geographic corridor that we had been assigned to establish eventually this new fledgling church. Asbury was eventually given permission to move into the area. But rather than that being a story where we were displaced, it actually became the way God placed us here. The district got behind us, realizing how daunting that task was once they had given Asbury that permission to move in. They got behind us, paid for $300,000 of our first $350,000 purchase for 10 acres. We then had a toehold geographic in the same area that kind of said to the world that, no, this church really is going to happen. And Asbury, not the foe that we had mistaken them for initially, actually became one of our best friends. They helped us pay for this building, gave us $125,000. That's why the fountain out front is named the Asbury Fountain, for their generosity and their partnership. So if Asbury hadn't moved into the area, the district would have never been a partner with us in getting the land, and we wouldn't have gained a significant partner in building the building. What an amazing way God works. We hit another wall right after we moved into this facility. It had been such an arduous journey, 7 years of trailer church and moving locations, overcoming impossible odds. And when we finally got in this building, it was as if we fell across a finish line. Everyone was exhausted. And some people, after those pioneering years, which is what they enjoyed, they decided now that we're established, it's done. And they went on to other opportunities to serve the Lord that was more adventurous, I think, than an established church. But we fell across the line just just exhausted. Everyone was worn out. And the church, after it moved in and had its initial celebration, started to wane. Initially there was growth, but then we started to plateau and then fall off to such a degree that we were going to have to let go of staff. We couldn't pay our staff, small as it was. We were going to have to cut a staff person in order to survive financially. But we prayed about it. Steve Dickey shared with me a book that was changing his life. It was called The Shack, very unusual book. And so instead of cutting a staff person, within 2 months we decided to do the Shack series. We bought $2,000 worth of Shack books to give away. I didn't know how I was going to pay for them. It wasn't in the budget. We didn't fire our staff person. We again had an adventure to reach people in our community for Christ, hurting people. And the Shack proved to be that kind of instrument in God's hands. We invited people into our church, told the biblical truth behind the fictional story, and people's lives were being changed. People with years and decades of hurt were getting healed. And the church went from a couple hundred in attendance to almost 400 as an average during those 10 months. We were in the papers. We had built a shack on the stage. The church became the talk of the annual conference. Something was happening here, and God again had stepped in and told us that He wasn't finished with Abiding Harvest yet. In the aftermath of bringing so many hurting people into our church, it was amazing how God moved to establish very quickly a Celebrate Recovery ministry here within our church, and that thrived for several years. During that time, we also reached out in the community with Life Tree Cafe, a way to get beyond the church and share Christ. We were at a local Mexican restaurant every Tuesday night, sharing Christ with those who didn't know Him. But both of those fantastic ministries had their season. We also had to learn how to let go of great things. But the church continued to be strong. Though some ministries were coming and going, our home teams were a backbone that kept the church consistent and strong and connected, growing in Christ and growing with one another. And then in Christmas of 2014, we got one of the biggest surprises of all. An anonymous giver had said that they wanted to give the church $1 million gift. Yes, I almost fainted when I first heard of that. And the church was breathless when we first got the news. But instead of just celebrating that good gift or fighting over how to use it, the church responded with raising almost $1 million additionally in order to build the AMAC. And that's become an incredible tool in God's hands. We celebrate the pickleball ministry and the way that's expanding and undergirding our youth program. But once again, God had given us a million reasons why He wasn't finished with us yet. Who would have imagined some 15 years ago when we started this church that we would be where we are today? We started with folding chairs in a garage in a place we lovingly call now the Corvette Cathedral. And yet through the years, God has done so much. Who could imagine God would use us to be the ones that are at the center of a defeat of a casino that wanted to come into this community? But we stood our ground. Who would have imagined that we would build a church in Honduras, build a dormitory in Belize, build a house just across town in West Tulsa, send couples to faraway places like China and Kenya and India and Nepal? Who would have imagined how God would use this church to make over 100 professions of faith in the last few years? In 15 years, God has done so much, but He's not done yet. Just a year ago, we were surprised by a gift of $1 million. God seems to be saying to this church, remember who you are. You are an abiding harvest, a living harvest, a lasting harvest, and I am not through with you yet. In this time when things seem to be getting darker, God is empowering us to be a penetrating light in our culture. Can you imagine a generation ever more at risk than the one that God has called us to serve in this time and in this day? God isn't finished with Abiding Harvest. Can you imagine what God's next might look like? At the same time, we were feeling a calling to grow this church as an instrument. That sounded like a very selfish thing. God put on us a deep sense that we were not just supposed to be a good church, we were supposed to be a church that impacted the city. We started thinking about kingdom impact. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, not just in church, But in the city, God's heart is for the world. Our heart started burning to make a difference beyond our walls. We adopted Aspen Creek as an outreach where we could continue to touch our community. We started Single Moms Ministry with Emerge and started reaching out to that great need in our community, though we didn't know if it might overwhelm us if we did it. Terry led that effort courageously. We built a harvest garden and started trying to do things to integrate the generations as they worked together out there in the soil and actually produce food that we could then give away to the people that we were discovering in the community. The synergy of all that started to hum. And it's interesting, you know, when you reach out to your community, you actually start to look a little bit more like your community. All of a sudden, our ethnic diversity started to become more rich. Our church is looking a little bit more like the kingdom of God because we're trying to have kingdom impact. I celebrate that. God's come through yet again. He's not finished with us yet. Who knows the church that we're yet to be, what it'll look like. And isn't it just like God in the midst of a denominational setting that's really coming apart? We're diverging. Future is more uncertain than ever. God at the same time intervenes and starts a movement of unity in our community. And our church is one of the founders in that, one of 3 churches that first started to reach across ethnic lines to try to bring the community together and worship the same Lord with a spirit of unity. At the same time, I feel myself diverging from other Methodist ministers within our conference and within our connection. Our paths are diverging. At the same time, we seem to be gathering a sense of real unity, of brotherhood, with pastors that didn't even know each other across denominations, lifting up the same Christ, worshiping Him, asking God for revival in our community. What an amazing thing the unity in the community services have become. I'd be remiss not to at least give a nod of the hat to the incredible staff that has served this church through the years. I wonder if I asked you, how many paid staff people have we had at Abiding Harvest through these 20 years? How many would you guess? Well, if you guessed less than 30, you're mistaken. We've had 30 different staff people that have supported the work of this whole church as we work together as one body. What an incredible group that's been. I'm thankful especially for those staff that have borne the length of that journey. Dana Griffith, who's been with us since 1999. And soon after that, Terry joined us at a time where we could not afford another staff person. Stretch of faith considerably. We asked her to come, even though we were behind in our budget, that somehow we would come up with enough funds to pay her salary faithfully. It was a risk, but thank God, when you invest in the kingdom and get out there on the limb, we found fruit, and the church continued to grow. We never had a problem with our budget during that season. Thank God for Terry and the investment she's made in setting the spiritual climate and culture of our church over these 20 years. She's been an incredible partner in ministry. I'm so thankful for the staff that we have now. You'll see the faces and the names of many of those who have served us through the years on the screen right now. So thankful for the staff we have now. Probably the strongest team we've ever had in our church is now the team that we have to face the future together. I used to know most of what was going on in our church at one time, but that's not the case anymore. In any given week, I'm lucky to know 50% of what God is doing through the staff and through the members of this church as you make a kingdom impact in the community around you. There's far more than I could recite, far more than I could record. It's going to take many, many voices, not just mine, to tell the story of what God is doing here now and in the next 20 years. I can think of voices of children as they will become adults, the voices of different languages here and at different places across the globe, voices in our city that are yet to profess Jesus as Lord. But they will, because our Father is still working, and because His Spirit is still moving, and because we're still partners, because from these prayer-staked acres to our first buildings, to an expanding witness into this community, God's still afoot, and He's still moving through Abiding Harvest. We're still living into that name. Thanks be to God, He's far from finished with us yet. Congratulations on your first 20 years. You've built a foundation here for the future, a mission station that will continue to thrive. The sacrifices of the last generations have become the blessings of this one, and our sacrifices and our faithfulness will pave the way for a faithful future. And the best of all, is that God is still with us. We still have a front row seat to what He'll do next. Because of Him, we are, we've been, and we will continue to be our Lord's abiding harvest.